Good afternoon. Welcome to this time together. Tests of manhood. What are things that test your manhood? It's approximately 10 years ago when it was time for about a 40 foot tall oak tree in our backyard needed to come down. It was starting to die, and some of the big branches were starting to fall, and so we decided it's time to bring it down before it brings somebody down. So our community had an auction. Our youth group had an auction where you could the youth would auction themselves off, and you could buy them for a morning, an afternoon, or a day. And so I bid, and I got two or three guys to help me. I was going to take down this tree. And when the tree was laying down, just to give you the idea of the size of this thing, it was over 100 years old. So when it was laying down, it was sitting about 4.5 to 5 feet at the base. And so if you're going to cut down a tree that size, you have to either have a long saw, or you have to be fairly accurate to cut in one side, cut in the other side, and come together. Well, I didn't have that kind of experience, and neither did the guys that I worked with or that I hired to do this. Anyway, and how we're going to do it is we're going to cut it, and then we're going to get actually before we started cutting, we got a lift and got up and put some straps around it, and then it was a 2-inch strap, and it was used, and then it wasn't quite long enough, so we used some chain, and we hooked it to a 3/4 ton truck, pickup truck, 4-wheel drive. And that day it had been raining a little bit, so it was a little bit wet. So there's about 4 or 5 of us out there. These 3 helpers, a couple of our children, and myself. And I was the person in charge because I had hired these guys. I wanted the tree down. It was in our backyard, actually Deeper Life's backyard. And right beside this large oak tree is a line of pine trees. The largest of them being about some in this range. And just on the other side of these pine trees, these row of pines, it's actually 3 rows of pines. And on the other side of that is my neighbor's house. So from the pines about 50 feet away, 60 feet away. Anyway, so we started cutting this tree down. And we cut one side and went to cut on the other side. And I started to notice, hey, it's moving up there. And the truck was hooked up, and I told them, okay, we're going to start pulling. Well, they started pulling, but the tree didn't give. It would kind of rock. You know how trees do when they're not cut off properly, especially that size. So we tried back and forth. And we thought we'd get some motion going, like momentum, so back and then forth. And the truck itself, when it would pull, like it was about 40, 50 feet away. And so when it came to the point where the tree would rock back, it would pull the truck back or lift it almost off of the back end. So the momentum just wasn't there. And so one time he went back, and as the tree came this way, he also went this way. But he only got so far, and then the tree pulled him back. Well, on one of those occasions, several things happened. One, it went toward the truck and then pivoted back, and at the same time that it pivoted, it broke the strap. And when it broke the strap, it decided it's not going to go back, it's not going to go toward the truck, or it's not going to go back the way it pivoted. It actually went into the pine trees. No kidding. It took over. It just snapped pine trees about this size. I was horrified. And when it went, it didn't stop in the pine trees. It actually went, and I thought it's going to hit my neighbor's house. And if the tree was 40 feet high, my neighbor's house was about 50 feet away. You can do the math. It didn't quite reach my neighbor's house. Now, that was a test to a degree of my ability. In some ways, it tested my sanity. I've tried on different occasions to take trees down, and I've not had good success with it. So whenever I talk about I'm going to take a tree down, my wife is, "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" We got it. Tests of manhood. When we think about tests for men today, the culture, what are some standards by which men measure themselves? What are some standards by which you measure yourself? I did a little bit of thinking and just considering here's some things that came to my mind when I thought about some of the things that how men measure themselves, how they test, by what standards they measure themselves. Some measure themselves by their net worth. That is, how much he's worth in dollars and cents. He's measured by dollar signs or things after his name. Things like, you think of people like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates. These men are known by their amounts of money or numbers they have behind their names. Otherwise, we don't really know them. I don't know them otherwise. Some men measure themselves by their position or their title. And things like CEO or COO or CFO or president or vice president. If you take away the title, so goes the man. They're so closely tied together, that's how they measure themselves. Another way that men can measure themselves is by the number of medals accumulated. You think of sports figures, like you understand what the term GOAT stands for, the acronym GOAT, like greatest of all time. And that's how they measure. And that's why for some, retirement is very, very difficult. Because all of a sudden, what they've done is how they're known, and when that's taken away, they don't have a life. Is that how to measure? Is that a good way to measure? Some measure themselves by their physical features, their size, their height, their strength. And those are things that men tend to measure by. This morning, somebody said, I think Roger said, men like to measure. We like to compare, we like to compete, and these are all ways that we do it. Some measure by their physical abilities, speed, strength, endurance, kinds like these. How many of you have heard the name Joey Chestnut? What does Joey test himself? How does he measure? How's Joey Chestnut measured? What do you know about Joey Chestnut? For those of you who raise your hand. That's right. How many hot dogs he can eat? His record is 63. Wow. I mean, for some, that's a lot of hot dogs. Some measure themselves by their philanthropy, giving to humanitarian causes, how much they give, how much money they give, how much time they give. That's how they measure. Some measure themselves by their education, like those things that are after their names, those acronyms like GED, maybe a master's or a bachelor's, a master's, a philosophy, doctorate. Some measure themselves by the number of businesses that have their name on them, on the business. Some men measure themselves by the numbers of acres they farm or own, or how many cows they milk, or how many cows and cattle they have, by their chickens, by their eggs, by their employees, by their dogs, their cats, their children, their vehicles. It's just, you name it, and that's the number of things by how men can measure themselves. The occasions are innumerable, the things that we actually measure ourselves by. So, let's start with thinking about what is a test. What is a test? Let's define it a little bit. A test, according to dictionary.com, is the means by which the presence, quality, or genuineness of anything is determined. It can also mean a means of trial. So when you think of a means by which something is, you see if something is present, is you think of a battery tester. So a battery tester is a means by which you test a battery. Or a math quiz is the means that you would use to see if someone understands how knowledgeable they are with numbers, with math, and how skillful they are with those numbers. In the Bible, tests or trials are means God uses to help us see the presence, quality, or genuineness, or lack of, a spiritual quality. For example, in James 1:2, the author writes, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations," or you could use the word trials or tests, "knowing this, that the trying of your faith," there it is, that the trying of your faith, that's a test, "worketh patience." In essence, he says that God uses trials or tests as a means to reveal what is lacking or where quality of character can develop. So it's not just to show you what's lacking, okay, it does that, but it also, from another aspect, it helps you see where you need to grow, where you need to develop. That's what James says. A test also, according to dictionary.com, is the trial or quality of something, that is, to put to the test. So to test the quality of something or someone requires that it be put to the test. So if we put this bench to the test here to see if it would hold the weight, we would actually have somebody sit on it. We have kind of a humorous way of testing some of our employees, or at my place of employment. So if some of the ladies talk about how, or even the men, talk about how they can make something, especially if it's something that's edible, okay, if they claim that they're able to make something, we put them to the test. We say, we don't believe it. You have to show us that you can actually do this. Then when you show us, then we will believe it. Okay, that's the second definition here. The third one is a particular process or method for trying or assessing. Okay, so that's a process or method for trying or assessing. As Roger mentioned, we're doing a renovation project at Deeper Life currently. And here about 2 weeks ago, 12 gentlemen from Bell Center came to knock out some walls, take down the ceiling, and just do a lot of demolition. Well, I came to help that day, and I'm not used to swinging a 12-pound sledgehammer. And so, in some ways, I was really out of my element. Now, these men that I interacted with or helped, worked with, okay, they're used to physical labor. At least most of them were. And so, I was swinging a sledgehammer beside some of them. I would swing 1, 2, 3, and my arms would start hurting. These guys beside me would just go, they would just keep swinging. I mean, I stand beside them, I'm like, whoa. Now, I just could not keep up. Actually, I started a little bit after 8. By 11:30, I was shot. I mean, it wasn't just my shoulders that hurt; my legs hurt, and so I decided I think I'm done for the day. I mean, it was a good feeling to have your arms and legs kind of have a tingling. At least it was for me, to kind of have that tingling. But it was just the fact. The truth of the matter was, I was out of shape, and this was a test. So by this process, through this method, I could see I was out of shape. We talked this morning, or some of the brothers that had the other topics, they talked about this. The next thing I want to define is the word manhood. I'm not going to say much. I think they did a good job in distinguishing between a man and a woman. Some of the, especially in the roles or even the gender. But manhood, basically Webster says this: the condition of being a human being, that is, it distinguishes a human person from an animal, from birds, from fish, things like that. Secondly, usually when we use the word manhood, we think of qualities that distinguish, that are associated with a man. That is manliness. We'll talk about what some of those things are. The third definition is the condition of being an adult male as distinguished from a child or female. Now, that definition today might not fly, but we're going to just stay fairly basic. This is what a man is. He's not a woman. He's not a child. He is a male. He has qualities of a man. And he's distinguished from animals, from birds, from trees, from fish. That's how you define what a man is. I'm just thinking about Bible characters that were tested. So is our tests just in 2022, or are tests something that men have faced all along? And tests have been since soon after creation. So here's just a few that I thought of. Biblical characters that were tested. The Bible records many tests that men faced. Adam faced a test of eating the fruit Eve offered to him. Abram faced the test of offering his son Isaac on the altar. Joseph faced the test of sexual temptation and false accusations. Moses faced the test of leading the Israelites for 40 years. That's a long test. Joshua and Caleb faced the test of giving a different report than the other 10 spies. I think about this, I think about courage. It would take courage to say, I have a different report than these do. The minority has a different report than the majority. Caleb and Joshua faced that. Achan faced the test of taking what was devoted to God. The first city that they came to, that they took, in Jericho. He saw, he coveted, and there was a test he took. David faced the test of going head-to-head with Goliath. The 3 Hebrews faced the test of bowing to Nebuchadnezzar's idol. Daniel faced the test of praying only to the king, Darius, for 1 month. Peter faced the test of identifying with Jesus. Jesus was tested in innumerable ways in his life on earth. we have a number of things that are recorded how he was tested. He overcame everyone, every test. The fact that men will face tests is a given. It's just a matter of time and occasion when it will happen. Jesus told the disciples, in this world you will face trouble. You could put the word test in there. Whenever you face trouble, you're facing a test of some kind. James prepares us for the inevitable when he says, count it all joy, my brethren, when you fall into many kinds of trials. In other words, Jesus tells us that tests are to be expected. James tells us how to view those as opportunities to develop perseverance, as an opportunity to grow in maturity. He also says, let no man say when he is tempted, I'm tempted of God. Like not point at God and say, God is tempting me. That's not the direction to go when we're tested or when temptation comes. Sometimes tests and temptations are part of the same package. In a test, God tests us for the purpose of showing us, for us and others to see what sort of stuff we're made of and where we need to grow. In the same circumstance of testing, our flesh recoils and complains at the suggestion of giving up personal desires and what feels comfortable. From God's point of view, He allows or sends tests to give us opportunities to grow. The flesh experiences those tests as occasions to avoid responsibility and enticement, and is enticed to sin. Nevertheless, tests will come. Their occasion is to show us and others what we're made of. And their purpose is to help us see where we can resist the temptation to sin and mature and live to please the Lord. I'd like to look at six categories of tests that men tend to face. There may be others, but here are 6 areas that I thought about. Tests for men by categories. Or what are the tests of manliness? This is just a different way of asking the same question. The first category to think about is men can be tested physically. Physical tests are, in many ways, this way. Many men measure their manliness by their physique, their bodily structure, and physical abilities. Muscles are important to boys at a young age. I remember growing up with 5 brothers, and from a young age, I was second to youngest. From a young age, I remember my brothers and myself comparing the size of our biceps. We would measure in terms of, obviously amongst ourselves, we would compare, but then we had a rating. Okay, so the rating was, if it was just where you could see it, it was a chicken egg. If it was in between, then it was a duck egg. And the final one, the big one, was a goose egg. Now, we had each of those birds at home, so that kind of was something to compare to. So the small was a chicken, the medium was a duck, the big one, and that was the goal, to get to the point where you had a chicken egg. And I can still remember my brothers when they would flex their arms, and they would have like muscles like on their biceps. I mean, that was the standard. That was the epitome. That's what the aim was, is to get a duck egg, a chicken egg, a goose egg for a bicep. I don't ever recall my 2 sisters comparing their biceps. They just didn't do things like that. Physical strength, speed, endurance, or agility are other means by which men measure themselves. Accomplishments, feats, and completing jobs is very satisfying to a man. Public performances provide an adrenaline rush for many men. While money is a factor in sports, public performances likely are the adrenaline rush that helps athletes go to the next level. A friend of mine observed that when men are working together and ladies show up, men tend to work harder. I wonder what it is. This has a downside to it. When you're on the losing team, the arrow misses the buck. Someone is stronger, quicker, and more accomplished than you are. Then it's a test. You measure yourself by things like that. In physical tests, some men measure themselves by their appetites. Here are tests. Appetites such as eating and drinking. Too much are tests. It's not uncommon for teenagers and young men to measure themselves by how much they can eat or how much they can drink. I remember growing up, some of my peers would measure themselves by how many cans of beer they could drink in a day. I was not necessarily interested in that kind of drink. I would measure myself by how many cans of soda I could drink in a day. And that was when people would say those numbers about how much soda he drank, it did something for me. So, something good. I'm not saying like it. Okay, when I say good, I'm saying at that age or at that stage, it affected me in a good way. Like in a good way, I'm not saying that it's a good way to measure, but it was appealing. That's the idea. Our son, 18-year-old son, went hunting with a couple of his friends recently. And the highlight of the hunting that day was that they ate 15 donuts. Tests, physical tests. Being sick or having a disease are significant tests for men because these can be, by one degree or another, affect a man's ability to perform. And for men, performance and identity is closely tied together. Some men often measure themselves by their accomplishments. When they have limitations due to sickness or disease, they feel trapped. Aging can be a significant test for men. Changes in strength, stamina, and ability to perform can be quite an adjustment. I think it was last year, a year before, I went deer hunting with the same son I was talking about earlier. He was 17 or 16. And he's about 6'3", with long arms and long legs. And so we shot a deer, and that thing decided to run the other way, like away from where the vehicle was. And so we had to drag it out. Now, I have an office job, and he's used to physical work. And he's only 16, 17 years old. And so when it came to dragging this animal out, he would take one step and I would take 2 steps to try to keep up with him. He would carry most of the load because his arms are so long, and he would lift it, and I would just be kind of almost running along trying to keep up with him. You know, it's kind of humbling to when, as a 51-year-old, trying to run after your son, trying to help him along when he's actually pulling you along. Aging can be a significant test for a man. Physical tests. Secondly, the area of sexuality. Sexual tests. Heterosexual or desire for the opposite sex. Okay. Heterosexual desire is a tremendous gift. Homosexual, that is same-sex attraction for men, can be demoralizing and a humiliating experience for men. Men that have these attractions and fight against them face a significant test both in themselves and in the culture in which we live. Just here in the last couple months, a young man that I know that actually grew up in a church that I was part of at one point, came out saying he is homosexual. He has same-sex attractions. He claims to be a Christian, and he feels like it's normal. In the culture, much of culture, that's acceptable. For men who have these desires and actually fight against them, see them as sinful, as perverted, that's a challenge in the culture. And personally, it can be a significant test. The ability to mutually enjoy sex in marriage is a tremendous gift. However, there may be times or seasons when for a variety of reasons that is not possible. When appropriate sexual desire is unfulfilled, it can be a significant test for men. Since identity and performance are closely related for a man, when he is unable to perform sexually in marriage, it may raise questions for him that he has not considered before. He may ask questions of himself like, what is wrong with me? Why am I not able to perform? And it can have a significant test for him about who he is. Fathering children is closely connected to performing sexually, but it has added elements. If inability to perform sexually raises questions about one's identity, inability to produce children touches on the subject of potency. Like, I am impotent. I can't even produce children. That can be a significant trial for a man. Since the fruit of sex is children, childlessness is a confirmation for some of worthlessness. Sexual temptations are a significant test for men. Lust, viewing porn, fornication, adultery are just some of the ways men are tempted. Like other sins, sexual sins usually begin with small violations, such as lust or viewing porn, and grow up into fornication and adultery. I heard the story of a family in China that went on a vacation. And while they were on a vacation, they saw this puppy. They fell in love with this puppy, and the children begged the mom to, let's adopt this puppy. So they adopted it, they brought it home, and they fed it, and did the normal things that you do with a puppy. There's one thing that was quite different with this puppy. They could not give that puppy enough food to eat. That thing would just eat and eat and eat. And so after a time, after it had grown up quite a bit, they took it to a vet one day. And the vet called the police. The vet realized there's something different about this animal. What they came to find out is that they had actually adopted or bought a Himalayan bear. And they thought they had a puppy. Actually, this thing grew up later where it was dangerous, where they actually returned it to the wild. That's how it is with sexual sins. It starts with a small puppy, if you will, but if you feed that, it'll turn around and it'll eat you. Sexual struggles, sexual tests, sexual temptation are significant tests for men. The third category of tests are mental or emotional. When I say mental, I mean your mind, like with your ability to think and reason. Mental capabilities or brain power refer to man's ability to think, reason, process, plan, and fulfill obligations and responsibilities. Some men have larger capacities and abilities than other men. Is that okay? Is that true? Okay. In some areas, okay, is that true as well? Like some men have larger brain capacities and are more gifted and whatever in some areas, but smaller capacities than other men in other areas. I think Dave referred to that generally, something like that earlier. The test for men is twofold and is similar to getting on a merry-go-round. On the one hand, men compare their mental capabilities to others and function as superior or inferior to them, to those other men. So they compare themselves and they function as I'm better than you or I'm less than you. That's the one way. On the other hand, men compete with each other, trying to outdo each other. This is the competition merry-go-round. In the same way that merry-go-rounds make people dizzy, comparing and competing results in men being dizzy with self-focus. Actually, you get focused on yourself when you actually compete or compare yourself with others. Actually, the Apostle Paul said something like, those who compare themselves among themselves lack wisdom, meaning it's immature to actually do that. But it's pretty common to do that. Emotional capacities refer to a man's ability to feel a wide range of emotions coupled with appropriate and timely expressions of those emotions. Particular tests for men are emotional awareness and emotional self-control. While all men are created with emotional capacity, not all are aware, don't give much thought to, or are uncomfortable with emotions. Men in this category have a difficult time identifying or connecting with their wives or other men who are more emotionally aware or in tune. Learning emotional language is a test. Emotional awareness grows as emotions are identified and acknowledged. Some men are emotional ice cubes. Other men are emotional roller coasters. These men feel their emotions and feel them deeply. In fact, they feel them so deeply that they are controlled by them. If they are sad, depressed, excited, relieved, angry, etc., it's quite obvious to everyone around them. Men in this category will face the test of emotional self-control, like actually learning to control themselves instead of being controlled by their emotions. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't be affected. It's okay to be affected by how you feel. But there has to be a sense of self-control as well. Tests for men. Another test for men is in the area of finances. Some men face the test of financial abundance. Do you know what that means? Like the word, okay, not the idea of financial abundance, I mean the test of financial abundance. Financial abundance can be the result of inheritance, a wise and timely investment, hard work, wise management, and a host of other factors. Some tests in financial abundance are integrity, managing or stewarding large amounts of resources, accurate accounting, deciding how much is enough, deciding between several options or models, stress, decisions, priorities, giving, humility. Brothers, we live in a land of plenty. That doesn't mean that everyone has the same amount. That doesn't mean there's no poverty. It just means we have resources and we have access to resources, and I'm suggesting that is a test. What are we going to do with it? Other men face financial hardship. This can result from economic inopportunity, inability, oppression, famine, handicap, unwise or untimely investments, etc. If financial abundance takes some men to the top of the heap, financial hardship takes other men to the bottom of the barrel. Financial hardships are the breeding ground for many temptations: cheating, falsifying, gambling, drinking, selling one's body for income, and other illicit ways to get ahead financially. I read about this story that this widow lady, she was part of a church, Anyway, she was a widow lady, and she had fallen on hard times. And the landlord in who she was renting from knew she was on hard times, but he offered her, if she would give him sexual favors, she wouldn't have to pay. When the deacons of her church found out, they commended her for being honest, that she had fallen on hard times, and they guaranteed her that she would not have to give in to this temptation. They would come to bat for her so that she wouldn't have to do things like that. Financial tests. The test of possession. Possession, we heard about this one quite a bit this morning from Dave and Tom. Possession is the office of leadership. The office of leadership is established and recognized by God. Leading, exercising authority, delegating responsibilities, holding people accountable are responsibilities of leaders. The authority of a leader is not inherent, but is a delegated authority. When Mr. Biden was elected to the office of the President of the United States, authority was delegated to him by Congress. When President Biden leaves that office, the authority is relinquished. He no longer has the authority to function in that office. So authority and office often, authority and responsibility often go together. I think Tom explained it very well. Sometimes, temptations for leaders can be to misuse or abuse their authority, micromanage, threaten, or favor are just some of the temptations. Sometimes leaders hold on to a position when they are physically or mentally incapable of faithfully executing the responsibilities. Those are some of the tests that men face in positions of leadership. A raise in position or rank, that is a promotion, increases responsibility and accountability. When men sometimes seek a rise in rank, but resent accountability. When a man is demoted in rank or position, that's called a demotion. It can test his identity and how he fulfills his responsibility. Additional tests in leadership are criticism, accusation, rejection, slander, correction, or when they are removed from office or from a position. Those can be significant tests for a man. And finally, spiritual tests. Spiritual tests fall into several categories. The first one is every man needs to decide what to do with Jesus of Nazareth. That is the ultimate question in spiritual matters. There's no decision of greater importance than this one. This decision will determine a man's destiny and shape how he lives his life. Acknowledge Jesus and he will acknowledge you. Deny him, he says he will deny you as well. Secondly, deciding to follow Jesus is an important decision in a series of other decisions. If you commit to follow Jesus, you will be tested. The world, the flesh, and the devil will test that commitment. Thirdly, your values and what you deem important will be tested. Your allegiances will be tested as well. Who is your ultimate authority? Who determines what is right and wrong? And your motivation for serving this Jesus will be tested as well. Jesus wants disciples who follow his example, not hypocrites, mask wearers, and not men who are perfect, but men who are maturing and progressively being conformed to his likeness. Okay, we're going to shift gears here a little bit. I've identified a number of tests that men face. You may not be able to identify with every single one, but likely here and there I touched on some that you would be able to identify with. From God's point of view, as I've said earlier, I said it a few times, this is what you want to get. If you miss everything else, this is what you want to get. From God's point of view, tests are opportunities for God to show you what He already knows. And many times, what He wants you to do about it. I've chosen to call these things character tests, because these tests reveal our level of maturity and character, and it gives us opportunity to grow in maturity. Every test I've mentioned in the category earlier have character qualities embedded in them. And so for this last part, what I'd like to do is to look at 3 qualities to develop when tested. But before we do that, I'd like to base the thoughts, those principles, on a passage from the Old Testament. And so I invite you to read with me Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 1 through 20. Just to give the setting for Deuteronomy 8. When the Israelites came out of Egypt, in those 40 years, those 600-some thousand people that came out of Egypt, in those 40 years, they died in the desert. The book of Deuteronomy is Moses reiterating what happened in those 40 years, kind of summarizing it for a whole new generation of people. Those people that he was giving this instruction to had not come out of Egypt. The only 2 that were present, the only 3 actually that were present was Moses, that came out of Egypt, was Moses, Caleb, and Joshua. All the other people had died. So this is a whole new generation of people that Moses is instructing just on the shores of the Jordan River, on the east side of the Jordan. So that's the setting, that's the context. Let's read Deuteronomy 8. All the commandments which I command thee this day shall you observe to do, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land which the Lord sware unto your fathers. And thou shalt remember all the way which the Lord thy God led thee these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble thee and to prove thee, or test you, to know what was in your heart, whether thou wouldest keep his commandments or no. And he humbled thee and suffered thee to hunger, and fed thee with manna, which thou knewest not, neither did thy fathers know, that he might make thee know that man doth not live by bread only, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of the Lord doth man live. Thy raiment waxed not old upon thee, neither did thy foot swell these 40 years. Thou shalt also consider in thine heart that as a man chasteneth his son, so the Lord thy God chasteneth thee. Therefore thou shalt keep the commandment of the Lord thy God, to walk in his ways and to fear him. For the Lord thy God bringeth thee into a good land, a land of brooks of water and fountains and depths that spring out of the valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley and vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of oil, olive, and honey, a land wherein thou shalt eat bread without scarceness. Thou shalt not lack anything in it, a land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills thou mayest dig brass. When thou hast eaten and art full, then thou shalt bless the Lord thy God for the good land which he hath given thee. Beware that thou forget not the Lord thy God, in not keeping his commandments and his judgments and his statutes, which I command thee this day. Lest when thou hast eaten and art full, and hast built goodly houses and dwelt therein, and when thy herds and thy flocks multiply, and thy silver and thy gold is multiplied, and all that thou hast is multiplied, then thine heart be lifted up, and thou forget the Lord thy God, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage, who led thee through that great and terrible wilderness, wherein were fiery serpents and scorpions and drought, where there was no water, who brought thee water out of the rock of flint, who fed thee who fed thee in the wilderness with manna, which thy fathers knew not, that he might humble thee, and that he might prove thee, and to do thee good at thy latter end. And thou say in thine heart, My power and the might of my hand hath gotten me this wealth. But thou shalt remember the Lord thy God, for it is he that giveth thee power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant which he sware unto thy father, as it is this day. And it shall be, if thou do at all forget the Lord thy God, and walk after other gods, and serve them, and worship them, I testify against you this day that you shall surely perish. As the nations which the Lord destroyed before your face, so shall you perish, because you would not be obedient unto the voice of the Lord your God. In this text, God identifies a fourfold test for the Israelites when he led them through the desert. The first one was to humble them. The second one was to prove or to test them. The third was to help them see what was in their heart. And the fourth was to see if they would obey him or not. 3 tests. 3 things that the Lord wants to show you, wants to show me when he tests us. This is the purpose of tests. You will face tests. The question is, what should you do with a test? Here are 3 things you can do in a test. Here's God's purpose. The first of the tests is, it's a test of humility. The first on the list of God's tests for Israel is humility. Humble is mentioned 3 times, and there's at least 2 allusions to pride or arrogance in this passage. Humility is the quality of spirit that recognizes its smallness, insignificance, and sinfulness before Almighty God. In contrast to pride or assertiveness that rises up when things don't go my way, humility bows itself and is willing to yield. And not just outwardly yield, this humility of spirit, is something on the inside. This is not something that someone can do for you. This is something that you, yourself, that is something that happens to you. You do it on the inside. And its fruit is shown outwardly. Humility is the first on the list of the 8 Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. We could say the poor in spirit actually is another way of saying blessed are the humble. Think of the Beatitudes as think of the Beatitudes as 8 steps on a staircase. Okay? The bottom rung, the bottom step is humility. If you try to take the second step, or the third, or the fourth, or the fifth, any one of those, you will actually fall down. You will come back to the bottom one. If you try to get over the first one, you miss the first one, you miss all the others. If you step on the first one, that is, if you are humble. Humility leads to sorrow for sin. It leads to meekness, a hunger and a thirst for righteousness, so on and so forth. This past Thursday evening, our 18-year-old son and I had a disagreement. He thought we used one set of binoculars. I thought we used another set. We were over at our neighbor's and we were glassing our other neighbor, hunting in the woods, and we could see. It's about 600 yards away, so we had one pair of binoculars, and we would share them back and forth. And I thought they were his binoculars, and I thought they were his binoculars. He thought they were his binoculars. But they were actually my binoculars. So, sorry, I thought they were his, he thought they were mine. That's how it was. So a couple days later, we were disagreeing about this. And in my mind's eye, I was sure they were his binoculars. Because it said on them, the number 15 by 56. And I knew mine were thus and thus. I could still see it in my mind's eye. Well, we were going back and forth, and he had his reasons, and I had my reasons. And finally he said, well, I'm going to go get the binoculars. Well, when he left, I said to my wife, you know, I was wrong one time. Well, I thought I was wrong. But actually it turned out I wasn't. She kind of gave me this wry look, and she went, oh, it must be very painful. She told me, she clarified it later for me. She said, what I meant is, it must have been painful for your ego to admit that you were wrong. No, in all seriousness, humility is an important quality to God. Philippians 2 is a call for believers to have the mind of Christ in humility. Scripture repeatedly instructs believers to humble themselves and reminds us that before honor is humility. The Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar learned a difficult lesson in humility. We can humble ourselves so that God doesn't have to. So in a test, the first quality in a test is, will you be humble? If you're not humble, do you want to learn humility? God will teach you if you want to learn it. The second character test is the test of integrity. The test of integrity. Deuteronomy 8 says that God tested Israel to know what was in their heart, in verse 2. The means that God used to test Israel on this occasion was the desert or the wilderness. Okay, the wilderness was hot, it was dry, they lacked the necessary things, and that was a significant test for them. In verse 7, the test the future Israelites would face would be in the land of Canaan. The test in Canaan was abundance. They would have water, food, and resources to their heart's content. Verse 10 says, when thou hast eaten and are full, then shalt thou bless the Lord thy God for the good land which he hath given thee. Verse 11 is a warning. Beware that thou forget not the Lord thy God. Proverb writer says something similar. He says, give me neither poverty nor riches. Why not? And he goes on to explain why not. In the one, he says, lest I, in poverty, lest I something, and when you give me everything that I want, I forget you. I think in the one, when I don't have what I need, I curse you. Because that's a temptation, right? When the Lord doesn't give us what we want, we lash out. But when the Lord gives us abundance, it's the Lord. Who is the Lord? That's a temptation. Merriam-Webster defines integrity as one, a firm adherence to a code, especially moral or artistic values. A firm adherence to a code of, especially moral or artistic values. And secondly, an unimpaired condition, that is soundness. And third, the quality or state of being complete or undivided. And honesty is a synonym for integrity. God tested Israel by withholding basic necessities from them, and he tested them by giving them much more than what they needed. Both occasions were tests to bring out what was in them. These tests did not put into Israel what came out of them. The tests were the catalyst, the medium, or the means that God used to reveal what was in them all along. You have to take my word for it. There's water in this cup. You can't see it. This left hand is the catalyst that'll bring out what's in this cup. Okay? This hand doesn't put what's in this cup in here. It's simply the catalyst that brings it out. It's the medium that God uses. Okay? Think of a test that way. So whatever is in here will come out. That was the objective for God leading the Israelites. At least the one objective was to lead them into the desert to bring out what was in them. So the question is, when you are tested, you have an opportunity to become aware of what is in you. If you live up to God's standard, praise the Lord. Like what is inside of you, maybe when you get bumped, when you get hit, maybe pure water comes out. Praise be to God. What do you do when you become aware of sin? I think most of us can identify with that one. Hebrews 4 is an invitation to bring our sin to the throne of God's grace, where you will find mercy. It's not enough to become aware of sin. We must do something about that sin. We can bring it to Jesus, who can forgive and cleanse. Tests are the process by which God shows us what is in us and what needs to change. Lastly is the test of obedience. The test of obedience or conformity. Conformity is just another word for obedience. Conform from, instead of conforming to this, to conform to this. In Deuteronomy 8, there are at least 6 references to obeying the Lord. The phrase is, observe to do, keep the commandments, judgments, statutes, lest you forget the Lord, and be obedient unto the Lord, all refer to Israel giving up or turning away from what they wanted to do or were doing to yield themselves to do God's will. God's process of testing Israel culminated in this: will you conform yourself to my will, or will you continue in your own way? You see, when God tests us, okay, He wants us to be humble. Humility acknowledges just as humble before the Lord. Okay. Secondly, God wants to show us what is actually in us. Maybe some good is there, but often there's stuff there that should not be there. Okay, when you see things that should not be there, okay, this is the opportunity that God wants to show you, not just what is there, but what to actually do about it. And when it comes down to it, you cannot keep going your own way and going the Lord's way. Many times, what the Lord wants, you may want too. Okay, then you're step in step. But many times it comes down to what you see in you and what the Lord wants. They are opposed to each other. The question is, what are you going to do? You can't keep going 2 directions. You got to either yield yourself to the Lord or go your own way. Will you conform to my will, or will you conform to your own will? Romans 12, 1 and 2 read like this. I beseech you therefore, brethren, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And then he says, be not conformed to this world, but be you transformed by the renewing of your mind. That is, not conformed to how the world wants you to live, or even how you yourself want to live. Yield yourself to the Lord. Philippians 2:5 says, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. The Apostle Paul prayed that God would remove his thorn in the flesh. God told him that his grace would be sufficient for what he needed. Do you know that Jesus can identify with you in the struggle of obedience? Hebrews 5:8 says that Jesus learned obedience by the things which he suffered. Jesus never struggled with God's will except when it came to going to the cross. We don't have record that Jesus ever said, I don't really want to do this. Except in the Garden of Gethsemane. When it came to going to the cross, to giving his life, to dying alone, that was the test. In the garden, he prayed 3 times. Not my will, but thy will be done. Jesus really can identify with us. Are there areas where you struggle to submit your will to God's? Are there areas where you struggle, where you would rather do your own thing than God's way? Ask him for grace to help you think his thoughts after him, to be teachable, and to yield your will to his. In conclusion, men face many tests. They vary in kind, occasion, and intensity. God has purposes in tests. One is to humble us. The question is, in a test, will we be humble? We can humble ourselves, or God will humble us. He will help us see our need of him. The second purpose is to show us what is inside of us and what we need to do about it. Question is, will we turn to him with our need? And lastly, the third purpose in tests is that he wants us to learn to obey him. He actually knows what is best for us. This is the culmination of the test. Will you obey me? Humility, cleansing, and finally, conformity to his will. Those are the tests of character that you will face. God bless you.